and welcome to Ye Olde Bestsellers Book Club, where I am taking a look at some of America's earliest best-selling novels. Today's book is The Choir Invisible by James Lane Allen, published in 1897. Allen was born and raised in Kentucky, which will surprise no one who reads this book. He is quite enamored with Kentucky, and it played a very important role in many of his works. This book takes place about 100 years before it was written, so set in the late 1700s. So it begins in, quote, the middle of a fragrant afternoon of May in the green wilderness of Kentucky, the year 1795. And then there's a big, honestly quite vivid, sort of scene-setting nature description. There's a few of those throughout, and I'll say I think painting very vivid images, especially of the Kentucky wilderness, is one of the author's greatest strengths. They're very pretty, they're very clear. We are then introduced to the young woman Amy Falconer, quote, whom many an old pioneer dreamed of when he fell asleep beside his rifle and his hunting knife in his lonely cabin of the wilderness. She was perhaps the first beautiful girl of aristocratic birth ever seen in Kentucky. Her horse is apparently very clumsy and trips a lot, which is kind of funny because this was otherwise described as a very peaceful, serene stroll through these lovely, beautiful woods with this elegant, pretty girl, and then her horse trips again, and her bonnet, quote, now hung down over her eyes like the bill of a pelican. She has a cloth bundle tied to her saddle, but due to all of this jostling, it falls off into the road, which she doesn't notice. Now, this book confused me a couple times at first because it sometimes likes to talk from its own present day, from when it was written, and describing events in the story as happening 100 years ago. So our introduction to the local schoolhouse is a lengthy paragraph about how in 1895 all of the school children are dead now, and the schoolhouse is ashes, and anyways, meet the schoolmaster, he's also dead now, but back in 1795 he was alive, and his name is John Gray. He's got, quote, much physical beauty in the head, but, quote, almost no beauty in the face itself. Whatever that means. He is a member of the Democratic Society of Lexington. There were a lot of Democratic-Republican societies around the states at that time. They generally opposed the more federalist side of politics. They were pro-revolutionary France rather than favoring Britain. George Washington is generally not a fan of them. Usually, John would spend his evening studying law, but tonight he has somewhere else to be. So he walks off a couple miles into the woods to the Falconer household, where he startles Mrs. Falconer, Amy's aunt, who is out doing yard work. She wonders how he got there so early. It was a school day, and he admits that he rushed through his lessons. Quote, and is that the way you treat people's children? That's the way I treated them today. They lapse into silence, and then she says, how can you respect yourself to stand there idling and see me hard at work? But you do the work so well, better than I could. Besides, you are obeying a divine law. I have no right to keep you from doing the will of God. I observe you as one of the daughters of Eve under the curse of toil. There's no divine command that I should plant beans, but it is my command that Amy shall. This is Amy's work. Aren't you willing to work for her? She asked, slowly raising her eyes to his face. I am willing to work for her, but I am not willing to do her work. I'm not biblically literate enough to know what he's talking about, but I doubt that's what that divine law actually means. Also, John is going to be repeatedly touted as some paragon of virtue in this book, and when that happens, I want you to remember that his introduction was, I half-assed my job today and I don't like being helpful, woman. Anyways, Amy's not here doing her God-assigned bean planting because she's staying in town with a friend before a soon upcoming ball. John mentions that due to some lawsuit resolving, he should soon be receiving a share of $8,000 to $10,000, around $200,000 present day if the calculator I used was correct, then says, quote, you must know how long I have loved Amy. I have not spoken sooner because the circumstances of my life made it necessary for me to wait, and now I wish to ask her to become my wife, and I am here to beg your consent first. For some time she did not answer. At length she said, in a voice he could hardly hear, I have feared for a long time that this would come, but I have never been able to get ready for it, and I am not ready now. He isn't surprised by her opposition or upset. She goes on with, quote, I feel as though never in my life have I done a thing that is as near being familiar and unwomanly. Nevertheless, for your sake, for hers, for ours, it is my plain, hard duty to ask you whether you are sure, even if you should have her consent, that my niece is the woman you ought to marry. I am sure, he answered. Even if Mrs. Falconer and her husband withhold consent, he intends to ask anyways, because he loves her. She counters that, quote, I am not thinking of why you love my niece, I am thinking of why you will cease to love her, and why you will both be unhappy if you marry her. "My dear friend," he cried, his face aglow with impatient enthusiasm, and he suddenly lifted her hand to his lips. "I have but one anxiety in this whole matter. Will you cease to be my friend if I act in opposition to your wishes?" Okay, things get kind of awkward. She flushes a bit, goes back to her yard work. He says, "Yeah, I should go." On his walk home, he finds a bundle by the side of the road full of fine women's clothes and decides he'll take them to the printer's office tomorrow, which sort of serves as the town's lost and found so that lost things can be announced in the papers, or people looking to advertise that they've lost something might have their possessions waiting there for them when they go in to place an advertisement. But for the night, he takes the bundle home and stashes it in his closet, and we get a little description of his cabin, and then, quote, "Every complete man embraces some of the qualities of a woman, for nature does not mean that sex shall be more than a partial separation of one common humanity. If many a wife did but realize that she is perpetually observed not only by the eyes of a pardoning husband, but by the eyes of another woman hidden away in the depths of his being, she would do many things differently, and not do some things at all." If every complete man is expected to have these qualities, what defines them as womanly qualities? That sounds like they're just humanly qualities. If the women have them, but the men should also have them, why is this paragraph so weird? Quote, "The invisible slip of a woman in gray now began to question him regarding the bundle. Basically, he doesn't want to screw up this woman's clothes, so he takes them out and hangs them instead of leaving them in a crumpled pile. I would just call that considerate. Apparently that's a woman trait. He fantasizes about his future of Amy being his wonderful wife, then heads to school the next morning after bathing, so that's nice, people are bathing. While teaching, he has the thought that, quote, "Nature is cruel not to fit us for love and marriage as soon as we are born. Cruel to make us wait 20 or 30 years before she really lets us begin to live. What a pity that toddlers can't experience romance is a weird thought, dude." Also, apparently there's a game that was played at the schoolhouse that morning where the children barricaded themselves inside, pretending that, quote, "They were the pioneers, he was the invading Indians, let him attack them if he dared." He did dare, for he knew that otherwise there would be no school that day, or as long as the white race on the inside remained unconquered. He received some real knocks and whacks and punches, the end being arrived at when the schoolhouse door was torn entirely off its wooden hinges. Why are your school children being allowed to behave this way, sir? He gets a note in the middle of a lecture about a historical battle that we are treated to listening to a big chunk of for that fine Kentucky Fried flavor, stating that Amy can't go to the ball with him like she was supposed to for reasons that she doesn't specify. So he ditches his school children immediately and goes to the place that she's staying at, but she's not there, so he comes back later that night and he's planning to propose. Amy is with her friend Kitty. We learn, though John doesn't, that she's decided she can't go to the ball because she lost her fine clothes in that bundle that fell off on the road. But she doesn't want to tell John because she doesn't think he would understand. Quote, "He was always ready to take this manner of patient forbearance with her as though she were one of his school children. Tonight she was in no mood to have her troubles treated as trifles or herself soothed like an infant that was crying to be rocked. I have been given exactly 0 reasons to think that this marriage is a good idea, but there's another reason why it probably isn't." She flat out ignores John for a bit after they sit down, talking only to Kitty, and then when she is willing to speak to him, says that he shouldn't ask what her reason is for not going to the ball, which he says he wasn't planning to, and that if she wanted to tell him, she would, and she seems offended that he's so disinterested in the thing that she doesn't want to tell him. Jiminy fucking crickets, this is exhausting, and I don't like any of these people. Kitty leaves the room, very randomly, and Amy's demeanor changes. Quote, "There was no one now before whom she could act, no one to whom she could show that she could slight him, play with him. The ill humor had not been very deep. Nothing in her was very deep." Wow. He asks her not to treat him one way in front of others and another while alone, which fair, and while he's very nearly approaching the subject of marriage, Kitty comes back. With candy. Okay. John leaves at some point. It's not really clear how the rest of that evening went, and he thinks things over. Quote, "Little by little he went over the circumstances judicially in an effort to restore her to lovable supremacy over his imagination. He wrought out her entire acquittal, but it did no good." We then skip over to the printer's office on the evening of the ball, where the man who owns the place is out of town, but his assistant is in, quote, "A young man by the name of Charles O'Bannon. He's kind of drunk, planning to go to the ball, and, quote, had two ruling passions, the influence he thought himself entitled to exert over women, and his disposition to play practical jokes on men. He would 100% be a terrible prank YouTuber or something were he to exist in the modern day, and I can only say to that, yikes. He has a thing for Amy that she's never reciprocated, but he thinks maybe the fact that he's dressed nice at the ball will do it this time. Into his office comes Peter, a local blacksmith, and he wants to place a new advertisement in the paper. And they do that, they write one out, it's terrible, and then O'Bannon says he's going to tell Peter a secret. That John has given him Amy's bundle of lost clothes to put a note about them out in the paper, and Amy has come by looking for them, but he's waited to take them to her until kind of the last minute to keep her from going to the ball with John, who he apparently has issues with. Peter is at first upset about O'Bannon bad-mouthing John, who's apparently a friend of Peter's, to which O'Bannon replies, quote, "Well, only the other day I heard him say that he thought a good deal more of your shoes than he did of you." Peter made no reply, but his neck seemed to swell and his face to be getting purple. That seems excessive, sir. Also, remember later how relatively tame this insult was? O'Bannon tries and fails to get up and leave a couple times, but he is very, very drunk. Then, quote, "Peter," he said with a soft smile, looking down at his gorgeous swansdown waistcoat and his well-shaped dove-colored legs, "ain't I a beauty?" "Yes, you are a beauty," said Peter. Suddenly lifting one of his bare feet, he shot O'Bannon as by the action of a catapult against the printing press. He lay there all night. For several reasons. May I say... What? Setting aside "ain't I a beauty" and the fact that I'm really not sure on the physics of this foot-based catapulting, I'm going to assume that just means he kicked him. But why? Were you just tired of him? I mean, I'm tired of him, but... Back with John, earlier this day of the ball, he receives a note around noon from Amy saying, quote, "Kitty is going to the ball with Horatio. I shall be alone. We can have our talk uninterrupted." How unreasonable you are. Why don't you understand things without wanting to have them explained? The whole point of the last argument you had was that he specifically was not asking for explanations, and that was why you were annoyed. Why are you like this? When he goes to meet Amy that night, he is told that she's not in. She's gone to the party. So he goes to the party and walks in to see her dancing with, gasp, a man named Joseph. Quote, "If he had stepped on a rattlesnake, he could not have been more horribly, more miserably stung." So, naturally, he walks inside and sits down for an hour-long discussion about some Kentucky-ass politics, which he apparently scarcely hears, and yet we get a full-page's summary of them anyways. After that's all done with, Kitty, and then Joseph again, and then Amy herself, all come up to him and try to get things explained, but he refuses. He doesn't even acknowledge Amy when she tries to speak to him. Then, quote, "Although they did not meet up again, he was made aware that a change had at last come over her. She was angry now. He could hear her laugh oftener, laughter that was meant for his ear. He looked at her repeatedly, but she avoided his eyes." My dude. She's having fun. This must be a personal attack against me. How dare she not look at me, this woman I ignored when she tried to talk to me 5 minutes ago? Her laughter must mean that she's angry, with me specifically. Watching her behavior for the rest of the night, he decides that he could never marry her because she's too attention-seeking, and he's so upset that he can't really sleep that night. He goes for a walk the next morning and notices that the door to the schoolhouse is open, and that's weird, there's no school today. So he goes inside, he doesn't see anything, he sits down at his desk and has a think, and he sees something as he's staring into the mist outside, maybe a dog. It comes closer, then comes in, and it's a cougar, and it wants to eat him. So he wrestles the cougar, and he actually does a pretty decent job until eventually it, quote, "with a deafening roar sounding close in his ears, had buried its fangs near the base of his neck until he heard them click as they met through his flesh." This whole attack is exactly as abrupt as it sounds. John collapses to the floor, and we cut to Amy later that morning, returning home to her aunt, whose name is apparently Jessica. Amy's feeling quite chipper. They discuss the ball. Quote, "How is Kitty?" she asked quickly. "Well, as always. And stupid. She is always kind and good, isn't she? And faithful. Kindness is not always interesting, unfortunately, and goodness is dreadful, and her faithfulness bores me to death. What has Kitty done to deserve this? Amy and John deserve each other. She's probably worse than him, but he irritates me, so..." Amy does eventually admit that last night she's gotten engaged, but she doesn't say to whom, so Jessica assumes John because of their conversation earlier, and she's kind of solemn about it, until Amy refers to herself as the future Mrs. Joseph Holden, at which point Mrs. Falconer is relieved enough to get around to congratulating her. It is only after they go inside and Amy starts unpacking that, quote, "Aunt Jessica," she remarked carelessly without looking round, "I forgot to tell you that John Gray had a fight with a panther in his schoolroom this morning." You forgot to mention you were on the cusp of getting engaged. He is a close family friend, and you casually forgot to mention that he was nearly mauled to death this morning in town. Not all the way to death, though. Apparently someone found him, and he's had medical attention, and he's back at home recovering. Jessica says she's going to go to him at once, and Amy is annoyed, because not only will she have to take Amy's horse to do so, but then she won't be home to make dinner, and Amy couldn't possibly do that herself, and at least pretend to care about other people's well-being, to be polite or whatever. Come on, Amy. John receives a lot of visitors during his days and days of bed rest. There's a lot of affectionate manly hand-holding in this book, and we get some of that with his friend, a local reverend. Jessica comes to see him several times, once bringing him a bunch of fresh linens and curtains and pillowcases, and he thinks, quote, "It was not the barren solicitude of a nurse, but the deliberate, luxurious regard of a mother for his comfort." And I am very uncomfortable with him calling her care for him motherly, given that there is a truly uncomfortable amount of bizarre romantic tension every time they are in the same room together. She also brings him a book, which she describes as her, quote, "old Bible of manhood. If you will always live by what is best in this book, love the best that it loves, hate what it hates, scorn what it scorns, follow its ideals to the end of the world, to the end of your life." We don't even get to know what this book is until much later. Now, Allen as an author is a lot more prose forward than the few other books I have done so far. In those, the text kept more to just things that were actually happening with less ornamentation and flair to it. The prose itself wasn't the point, it was just a means of carrying the story, whereas in Quire it feels more like the words and style themselves are supposed to be a big part of the appeal. I mentioned Allen's vivid imagery descriptions earlier. Sometimes it's also long metaphors to illustrate a character's inner emotions. He also likes to discuss the transition of Kentucky from untamed wilderness inhabited by the Indians to now having been conquered and domesticated by the Anglo-Saxons, so they can build homes for their wives. He always comes back to the white man's supposed love of wives and, like, a homesteading, as though the native people have been living here raising absolutely no families and never interacting with women or something. Those in particular felt the most repetitive and divorced from the actual narrative, but because I think his prose is one of his strong suits, I wanted to read in full one of his big, chonky imagery paragraphs. And also because this was one of the few moments where I was tricked for a second into having any investment or belief in the relationship between these two characters. So, quote, "Once upon a time, he had been walking along a woodland path with his eyes fixed on the ground in front of him, as was his studious wont. In the path itself there had not been one thing to catch his notice, only brown dust, little stones, a twig, some blades of withered grass. Then all at once, out of this dull, dead motley of harmonious nothingness, a single gorgeous spot had revealed itself, swelled out, and disappeared. A butterfly had opened its wings, laid bare their inside splendors, and closed them again, presenting to the eye only the adaptive, protective exterior of those marvelous swinging doors of its life. He had wondered then that nature could so paint the two sides of this thinnest of all canvases, the outside merely daubed over that it might resemble the dead and common worthless things amid which the creature had to live, a masterwork of concealment, the inside designed and drawn and colored with lavish fullness of plan, grace of curve, marvel of hue, all for the purpose of the exquisite self-revelation which should come when one great invitation of existence was sought or was given. As the young schoolmaster now looked up too quickly at the woman who stood over him, her eyes were like a butterfly's gorgeous wings that for an instant had opened upon him and already were closing upon the hidden splendors of her nature, closing upon the power to receive upon walls of beauty all the sunlight of the world. John spends the next several days fantasizing about what he knows about Mrs. Falconer's past and her history, including her family's, quote, tobacco plantations worked by troops of slaves. Oh, yay! During these descriptions of her past, she's mentioned as wearing a, quote, white linen mask tied over her face to screen her complexion from tan. And then later, quote, her face concealed by a black velvet riding mask kept in place by a silver mouthpiece held between her teeth. The mask thing sounded weird, so I took a brief trip down a rabbit hole. This sounds like what I mostly saw called a vizard, which are fabric masks that cover pretty much a woman's whole face, with just eye holes, and they are often held in place by a bead held between the teeth, which pretty much prevents the woman from talking. They are kind of terrifying to look at, partially because they seem to mostly come in black, so the face is just this silent, staring void. They should be in more historical films and horror movies about 18th century lady ghosts. They are horrible. I love them. The thought of John lying in bed at night swooning over this imagery of his lady love is deeply upsetting and very funny to me. He reads the book she brought him 3 times over before she comes back again, and that time she ends up cleaning his wounds, which makes him blush real hard, and then she starts talking about memories of wartime, very romantic, and then her husband, even more so, quote, of his perfect manliness, and she ended by saying that the worst thing that could ever befall a woman was to marry an unmanly man. If any one single thing in life could have killed me, she said, it would have been that. Following a conversation about war while tending panther wounds, declaring unmanliness as the greatest threat to your life sounds even sillier than it otherwise would. Once he feels strong enough to go walking around, John drops by to see Peter. That would be the blacksmith guy who foot catapulted a drunken O'Bannon earlier. Peter doesn't want to speak to John because he's still very mad about the comment that O'Bannon said that John had made about him, which, if you remember, was mildly rude, but really not that intense. John denies this because he didn't say that. Quote, "You haven't abused me," said Peter, wheeling on the schoolmaster, eyes and face and voice full of the suffering of his wounded self-love and of his wounded affection. "I feel like this is excessive, sir." They have a chat about O'Bannon's scheming, and Peter explains the whole mess with the bundle of Amy's clothes that eventually led to their breakup. John immediately heads off to the Falconer household and finds Amy alone, quote, at the sight of her and with the remembrance of how he had misjudged and mistreated her, most of all swept on by some lingering flood of the old tenderness. He stepped forward and put his arm softly around her, drew her closely to him, and buried his cheek against hers. She did not know that he was in the room, and she finds this very startling, which, yeah, dude, what the hell? But then they talk. He asks for forgiveness, and she's not really having it. He tells her that he'd been planning to propose, and she finally admits that she has already promised to marry Joseph, something that no one had mentioned to John yet. Quote, "If I had gone with you that night and had asked you, you would have married me." In a voice neither could scarcely hear, she said, "I will marry you yet," to which he says, "Goodbye." Literally. And so we cut to O'Bannon, riding through the woods, and we get a little explanation for his rivalry with John. He apparently covets the schoolmaster position for some reason. I cannot imagine this man being good with children. As he rides down the forest road, John appears, and then strips off half his clothes and declares that he wants to fight. He tries to convince O'Bannon to dismount. O'Bannon takes his whip by the little end and swings the handle end to slam down on John's wounded shoulder. Ow! Quote, "with a coarse, ugly, terrific blow, and the blood spurted." John nearly passes out, but proceeds to heave O'Bannon off his horse, toppling the two to the ground, and we don't really get to see how that ends. It just kind of says, "and they fight," and then we cut to several days later, where people are making fun of O'Bannon, so maybe he lost. They also make fun of his awkward riding, which makes him mad, so he places a bet that he could ride this barely broken horse that's on hand nearby. The horse immediately charges off and runs under a low roof, the edge of which catches O'Bannon straight in the head, knocking him dead to the ground. He's just dead now. It is so abrupt. And this is the second book I have done for this, where the hero gets a final climactic confrontation with their villain, and then on the next page, their villain has died for fully unrelated reasons. That happened to Magaw in Tom Grogan, and now it's here, and it feels so weird every time. We skip ahead to summer, where John is reading that same book that Jessica gave him, but we get to know what it is this time. It's Mallory's Le Morte d'Arthur. I don't know how to pronounce that. Her Bible of Manhood, apparently. I am by no means an Arthurian scholar, and I have not read Le Morte d'Arthur, but from a cursory glance, I think this is very much coming from the author being a 19th century man, rather than being a point of historical accuracy. Le Morte d'Arthur is a 15th century version of Arthurian legend, so it's certainly possible for John to read it, but by the looks of things, The 1700s were some of the least popular days that King Arthur had, whereas the Victorian era, closer to when this was written, saw a bit of an Arthurian boom. So John is reading passages about, quote, that lusty month of May, and the fact that nowadays men cannot love 7 nights, but they must have all their desires. Right so fareth love nowadays, soon hot, soon cold, this is no stability. But the old love was not so. Men and women could love together 7 years, and then was love truth and faithfulness. Nowadays, the kids these days don't know how to love anymore sentiment is people pining for, like, the 40s. But if a book from the 1890s is saying the exact same thing, envying the time of Arthurian legend, maybe the good old days are as mythical as Merlin, huh? John fully admits to himself that he does indeed have the hots for Jessica, Mrs. Falconer, and he is finding this book very distressingly relevant to his life, both in showing the virtues he aspires to and the vices he worries he will succumb to. And despite his concerns, he eventually can't help himself but go to the Falconer household, where he finds Jessica working in the garden again, and they sit on a bench to chat. Amy quickly comes over. Quote, she greeted John without embarrassment or discernible remembrance of their last meeting. Her fine blonde hair was frowsy, and a button was missing at the throat of her dress. Some women begin to let themselves go after marriage, some after the promise of marriage. There were cake crumbs also in one corner of her mouth. Wow, how dare she? A button is missing. How her beauty has faded. I might faint from shock. She leaves, and he and Jessica are alone again, and he dances around admitting his feelings, and then says that he's going to be leaving next week and going out of town for an indefinite amount of time. This is a trip that's been mentioned occasionally since the beginning. He knew it was coming, Jessica knew it was coming, but it wasn't important until now. Then he flees. John is a jerk to his reverend friend because he is frustrated that the reverend is daring to be happy while he, poor John, is having such inner distress that he also refuses to talk about. The reverend tries to be patient, and they later have a more productive conversation where they say their goodbyes before John leaves town, and the reverend tells him that, quote, of all the men I have ever known, you are the most sincere. Of them all I would soonest pick upon you to do what is right. Of them all you have the cleanest face because you have the most innocent heart. Of them all you have the highest notions of what a man may do and be in this life. In what universe, dude? John is occasionally fine. I don't despise him. I don't think he's the scum of the earth, but he is very much just some guy. He has not been at any point in this story exemplary. Don't inflate his ego undeservedly. Case in point, the moment the Reverend leaves, he walks all the way out into the woods to the Falconer house and lurks around in the dark and the moonlight, creeping through their garden, staring at Mrs. Falconer through their open bedroom window as she looks out into the night. Is this the worst of crimes? No, but it's a little stalkery, John. It's creepy to look in people's bedroom windows, John. He later says a final farewell to his school children, and it's a little weird, the speech he gives them about how great and wonderful some of their dead parents are, who tamed the great wilderness of Kentucky, so they shouldn't be sad about being orphaned, and they need to grow up to be good men and women. The boys, quote, must get over your rudeness and your roughness. As for my little girls, they are good enough as they are. And they all swarm in for hugs and handshakes, and he tears up a little when they all leave, and that's nice. I honestly wasn't that sure before this that he even liked them all that much. He keeps ditching them at every opportunity. He debates whether he should admit his feelings to Mrs. Falconer before he leaves, but he's torn. If he confesses, and she doesn't reciprocate, obviously that's sad for him. But if he confesses and she does reciprocate, quote, he could not behold her as anything else than a fatally lowered woman. If she could be faithless to one man because she loved another, could she not be false to the second, if in time she grew to love a third? And that is agonizing for him to even consider. Woe is me if she doesn't love me, but if she does, she's a harlot. So, quote, he had chosen the third tragedy, the silence that would at least leave each of them blameless. He still goes to say goodbye and encounters Amy, who is upset for all of 2 seconds that if he leaves tomorrow he'll miss her wedding on the same day, but she gets over that before he even has a chance to say anything. Apparently, she has completely forgotten about that I will marry you yet thing. That never comes up again. He very nearly approaches a confession to Jessica, but he doesn't. Again, they do discuss ideals and morality and virtue, which Jessica quite likes to do, apparently. This is not the first one of these chats. She talks about having great, unattainably perfect ideals like lighthouses to shine from afar and guide, but not meant to be lived in, just reached towards, and smaller, imperfect, but attainable ideals to, quote, burn like candles in her hands. Then, finally, he reluctantly leaves. After, Jessica makes him stop so she can take a final look at him, and very specifically has him take his hat off so she can look for one last time upon his forehead. And hair, but specifically forehead. The next day, he's supposed to be on his way to Mount Vernon. Instead, he hides in the wood by the road to watch Amy's wedding procession go by, thinking about the life that could have been his. He sits there until the sun goes down, and then eventually, finally gets on his horse and leaves. Quote, all that night he rode, and at sunrise was far away. Pausing on a height and turning his horse's head, he sat a long time, motionless as a statue. Then he struck his feet into its flank, and all that day rode back again. He makes it all the way back to the falconer's house again, but Jessica is in the garden with that book that she gave him. Quote, by that story she had judged him and wished to guide him. The smile smote his eyes like the hilt of a knight's sword used as a cross to drive away the evil one, for he knew the evil purpose with which he had returned, and so he sat watching her until she rose and walked slowly back to the house. And then he just leaves again. I could understand having him turn back and then see her and then decide to leave again and stick to his virtues and all of that, but having him ride all day and then all day again and then leaving again was more comical than anything else. Also, the fact that a whole fuss was made over the fact that he couldn't possibly go to Amy's wedding because he's leaving, and then actually he doesn't leave until much later in the day, so he easily could have gone. I can understand why he wouldn't, and if he was just using the, oh, I can't, I'm packing as an excuse, that would be one thing, but if that was the case, it wasn't clear, and it felt weird. From here, we skip ahead in time quite a bit to the various letters that he sends back home. The first is to that Democratic Society of Lexington that he was a part of and is now resigning from, because George Washington convinced him to change all of his politics. He is very into Washington now. His first whole letter to Jessica, his dear love from whom he is so tragically parted, is just him fangirling over Washington. Later, he sends Jessica news that he won't actually be getting the money from that lawsuit that he had mentioned at the very beginning, but he refuses her attempt to send him any money, even though, and he doesn't tell her this part, he ends up in jail for debt related to his lawyer fees. And it sounds like for practically cussing out his lawyer. He spends like 3/4 of a year in prison before some acquaintances he has find him and help him out and get him a job at one of their law offices. Jessica then later writes that her husband has died. She sells one of the major's military grants, which are pieces of land. Apparently, this grant is worth enough to build a big 2-story manor house, including a bedroom built specifically for John, with money to spare for the purchase of quite a few slaves. Ma'am. Now, John has been holding something back in the last few letters, but we don't get to know what it is yet, just that he's being brief and awkward and hesitant, and it doesn't feel like the right time to admit to her whatever it is that's going on, until she gets a brief note from him with an announcement that he has been married. Quote, and with the loosening of her tears came the loosening of her hold upon what she, until this night, had never acknowledged to herself, her love for him, and the belief that he had loved her. The years move on, some of John's schoolboys go to war and die, the Reverend gets married and has a lot of daughters, Jessica's fancy house entertains many guests, including Aaron Burr, apparently. She has a number of would-be suitors, but is interested in none. John goes on to have several children and becomes a judge, a very successful man. She wonders if, quote, had he too missed happiness, missed it as she had, by a union with a perfectly commonplace, plodding, unimaginative, unsympathetic, unrefined nature. Harsh. Then one day, while walking home, passing through her garden, a young man walks up who seems quite familiar, and he asks if she's Mrs. Falconer, and she says yes, and he says his name is John Gray. He's the son of her old friend, and his father has sent him to stay with her, if she's willing. Quote, for a moment, she looked at his forehead and his hair. Her eyes became blinded with tears. She threw her arms around his neck with a sob and covered his face with kisses. Madam, said the young fellow, laughing outright at his own blushes and confusion, I don't wonder that my father thinks so much of you. I never did that to your father. You'd think maybe you would ask her before sending your son to live at her house, but she doesn't seem to mind. She reads a letter that John sent along with John Jr., expressing how he wants her to help guide him as she guided John himself, and help Jr. into the life that he had wanted. Quote, "Through John shall be done what I could not do." Basically, he wants to live vicariously through his child. Sir, that is not always the best idea. Then he says he's going to tell her something that no one has or can ever know. Before we get to know what that is, we get one more reminder about Jessica's slaves, one of whom apparently sleeps on the floor in her room every night. Great thing to bring to my attention right before asking me to sympathize with her emotional pain, huh? While not in prison, John had been staying with a very nice family, apparently in Philadelphia, a mother, father, and an adult daughter who were very kind to him even while he was in prison. Quote, "One day I offered my hand to the daughter. I told her the whole truth, that there was someone else, not free, that no one could take the place of this other was filling. Nevertheless, if she would accept me on these conditions, everything that it was in my power to promise she could have. She said that in time she would win the rest." It was only a few weeks later that he learned that Mrs. Falconer's husband had died. Quote, "As soon as I could control myself, I told her that you were now free, that I should give her the chance to reconsider the engagement. I could promise less than before, I could not say how little." But she seemingly doesn't care, because they still get married. He discusses virtue and ideals of life again, and goes back to that metaphor she gave about candles and lighthouses. Quote, "And I have this belief, that if we did but recognize them aright, these ideals at the close of life would become one with the ideals of youth. We lost them as we left mortal youth behind, we regain them as we enter upon youth immortal. If I have kept unbroken faith with any of mine, thank you, and thank God." And scene, end of story. So, let's start with the Choir Invisible's review in the Bookman magazine from the June issue of 1897. The reviewer begins by comparing Choir Invisible to other popular works of the time and the different perspectives that these different books represent. Quote, "The wide moral divergence of these two points of view marks the vital difference between what has been called the literature of disillusion and the literature that serves ideal ends. It is the difference between the ballroom and the homestead, the one all sparkling and irritating and superficial and dangerous, the other all profound and calm and healthful and mighty. That religious purity of John Gray's nature lies upon every page of the Choir Invisible, holding it aloof from the exciting, the insinuating, the cynical. The Choir Invisible bears upon its front that unspeakable repose, that unhurried haste, which is the hallmark of literature. It is alive with the passion of beauty and of pain. It vibrates with that incommunicable thrill which Stevenson called the tuning fork of art. Mr. Allen never touches life but to transform it. Nothing is left common or unclean. No one who reads The Choir Invisible will doubt that Mr. Allen has given us something strong, deep, reverential that will teach us how to live. James MacArthur." No one who reads it, Mr. MacArthur? This will teach us all how to live. This is the most overwhelmingly positive review I have read in the Bookman so far. I guess MacArthur was exactly Allen's target audience. I am, perhaps not. Like I said before, I think Allen's way with words themselves is very strong. I think he's a good writer, but the full story these words are telling is fine. I do not think that John Gray is the utmost paragon of strength and virtue that we should all seek to emulate in our lives. I think he is a realistically flawed man, but he doesn't radiate religious purity just because he has enough willpower not to be a homewrecker, or because he doesn't like parties. Now, surprise twist at what otherwise would have been about the end of this, something else interesting is that this book is actually an extended and revised version of an earlier novella by this author, first published as John Gray, A Kentucky Tale of the Olden Time, which I did not read in full, but I did skim it semi-thoroughly. It's about half as many chapters, and the chapters seem to be about the same length, so I'm going to say it's about half as long, and it's very, very similar, but obviously condensed, and with some very interesting changes. Some small and relatively meaningless. Jessica is planting corn instead of beans when she and John have their first garden chat. We see more of John's morning bath the day after he finds Amy's lost bundle. Quote, "While taking his morning bath, he was struck by the beauty of his form, the tints of his flesh. He wished there had been a friend in the next room so that he could have run in and cried, "Really, look at my neck and chest and arms. My face does me much injustice. I am not ugly." Okay. The scene with John, Amy, and Kitty is changed in a number of ways. A small one is that when Amy asks John to look in on her horse for her, in Choir Invisible he snaps at her to give her orders to a servant, but in John Grey he mutters meekly that he would do so with pleasure. A bigger one is that Kitty never leaves the room in the novella. She tries, and Amy holds her back by the hand. And on one hand, this means that Amy and John don't get to speak alone, and that conversation was a good demonstration of their relationship. But the choir version of that scene just felt so much weirder, because I don't understand at all what Amy and Kitty were doing or thinking. Maybe that's a me problem, but I don't get why Kitty left suddenly without saying anything to go to the next room for 2 whole minutes until she comes back with candy. She spent the whole conversation aggressively third-wheeling because Amy doesn't want to talk to John, so then why does she leave? And if she's trying to give them space by themselves, why did she come back so fast? And Amy's reaction seems both annoyed that Kitty left, but also annoyed that she might come back, and while not making sense is pretty much one of her character traits, it's still confusing to me. The ending to the scene is also just so sudden. In Choir, in the novella, we are told the moment at which John gives up, makes a polite excuse, and goes home. In Choir, Amy says something, and there's a dialogue tag for it, and then it jumps straight into, quote, "He was in his room again, later that night with John." It's abrupt enough that I got worried the version of the book I was reading might be incomplete somehow and missing a paragraph or a line. I just think that the process of chopping this scene up to insert new material just got a little awkward. The new material isn't bad, but the effects that it had on what was already there, I think made things worse. And it's not the only scene I think was negatively impacted. The O'Bannon character is replaced by a very similar man called Stafford, and his drinking scene with Peter is different. In Choir, the scene is more condensed, which in some ways I think was good. His explanation of how he's screwing John over was more concise, and I appreciated that. In both versions, O'Bannon/Stafford, let's say Staff Bannon, offers Peter a drink, and Peter says, "No, let's write my ad first." The ad writing takes longer in the novella, but it's kind of funny, and they're only like 2 lines in before Peter cracks and starts knocking him back anyways. In Choir, Peter and booze is never brought up again after his denial until after like a page when Staff Bannon says, "Peter, I want to tell you a secret, but only because you're so drunk you won't even remember," whilst Peter is, as far as I'm aware, fully sober. And maybe Staff Bannon is just that drunk, and he can't even tell. But it confused me enough that I reread a few times to see if I had missed some time skip or something, and it threw me off, and I'm still not totally sure. So the John Grey version, I think, was clearer. And also less random as far as the ending. In Choir, Peter got annoyed, I guess, which is fair. And so out of nowhere, he just foot catapults Staff Bannon into the printing press and knocks him out, and it was very jarring. In the novella, they both get very drunk, and Staff Bannon gets touchy, and while, quote, caressing one of the blacksmith's bare arms, he says that Peter has never known the great passion that Sappho sings of. And Peter is offended. Of course he knows Sappho. That's the name of a horse he's supposed to shoe tomorrow. And for some reason, he is, quote, partly recalled to soberness by the thought of shoeing horses. Staff Bannon cannot comprehend this miscommunication. He is lost in the sauce. And he starts asking, quote, "Who do you say Sappho was? Who are you? Are you Sappho, Peter? Kiss me, Sappho. Kiss me, Peter. Kiss the devil," cried Peter, and in a struggle to save what was left of his modesty, he rolled backward to the floor with Stafford in his arms. There they lay all night. And I'm not going to say that this ending wasn't jarring in a different way, but I found it amusing, and it felt more naturally arrived at than the catapulting out of nowhere. The cougar attack doesn't happen in John Grey, and while I liked parts of that scene and some of the content that it led to, stretching the narrative to fit that plotline in led to some original elements of the novella now feeling weird when placed in Choir. For one, in John Grey, Peter is still very hurt by a second-hand insult that Staff Bannon claims John has said about him. It's honestly an even milder dig than in Quire, but Peter and John make up, the next day. And Peter even admits to being suspicious that Staff Bannon might have been lying. Whereas in Quire, Peter has been nursing his wounded ego through John's entire convalescence post-attack, never came to see him, and when John finally hobbles down to his shop to chat, barely steady enough to walk, Peter says, "I wish I didn't know you. Clear out." And these men are supposed to be friends, and this behavior just felt so nonsensical. Quire's Peter is a lot dumber and a bit of a dick, and every part of this felt much more natural in the original John Grey version. Another scene, slightly impacted by the addition of a cougar attack, is John fighting Staff Bannon. Because I don't know how John, random schoolteacher, wins a wrestling match while still recovering from his wounds. And that scene overall, I also felt resolved better in the novella. In both versions, we don't actually see the fight once they hit the ground. The most we get is a paragraph in Quire, comparing them to the wild animals that have fought out their primal rages in these very woods for centuries before, which is a shame in both. I actually think Alan is alright at action scenes, like what we got with the Panther before that also cut away before the very end. I don't know why he doesn't like resolving these things on page, but then Quire cuts right to Staff Bannon getting made fun of for a variety of reasons, and the text doesn't even explicitly state that he lost. We would just assume that from the way that his friends are treating him. And then he gets on a horse, head crack, dead. In the novella, the narrative follows Staff Bannon's horse, who leaves he and John to their fighting and goes back to town, which prompts a search party for its rider, which then finds a well-bruised Staff Bannon alone. And he makes up a story to explain his injuries, which no one buys, and soon the whole town knows what happened. It is specifically stated that Staff Bannon got his ass, quote, severely whipped, not literally. We see some differing opinions that people have about the fight. We learn that the town makes he and John shake hands and make peace. Then Staff Bannon gets on a horse and receives a knock to the head, but in John Grey, he is not killed instantly, but bedridden, and John is one of the first young men in town to come sit at his bedside. Then, quote, a week later, when the last darkness was settling upon him, he reached for Grey's hand, and laid it on his lips, not more gently had it been a woman's. The action was one of those which will perhaps be better explained in a better world than this, but it brought quick hot tears to the eyes of John Grey, as he bent over and kissed him. These old books never specify where or in what manner anyone is kissing anyone else, and it makes some scenes read in some probably unintended ways. But that doesn't matter. I like this version much, much better. I think Quire blew past the fight so quickly that I don't know why it was even still there. That version had no interest in exploring the consequences or emotional responses. John never even reacts to Staff Bannon's death on page. Their whole character arc just ends like it was in the way, and we're trying to breeze past it as quickly as possible to get back to talking about the divine manliness of King Arthur, I guess. The novella offers some resolution and gives John what I think was his most virtuous character moment. Everyone keeps insisting that he's this good man, and the only demonstration of that I felt like Quire gave is that he resists expressing his lust for a married woman, something no one around him even knows that he's doing, so I still don't know what they're going on about all the time. But coming to sit at the bedside of this dying man that he had had such a strong rivalry with, and them truly making peace, was nice. It let Staff Bannon evolve, it let John be likable for once, it wrapped up their relationship in a neat little bow. I really wonder why this original version had so much cut out of it. In between the drinking and wrestling sequences, John still sneaks up on Amy when he finds her alone, but it's even creepier in John Grey. He comes up and hugs her from behind, and she puts her arms back up to clasp around his neck and leans into it, but then talks to him, thinking that he is her uncle, at which point he leans down to kiss her without saying anything, while he knows that she thinks he's her uncle, and that is when she is startled and freaks out. She doesn't say, "I will marry you yet," at the end of the scene, only to never have that addressed again. The Reverend is an even more minor character, rather than seemingly a good friend of John's, and instead of a weird, vaguely misogynistic conversation where he has John play a game with him where they compare women to cats in bizarre ways, which happened in Choir Invisible, he has a weird, misogynistic conversation with John where he says that it's been so many generations since God created women that they are no longer a perfect expression of divine handiwork. And that is why marriages are miserable for men now, rather than, quote, every marriage being one of perfect happiness as was originally intended. You recall the case of the Arabian Nights, do you not? Was there ever a more overwhelming testimony to the decline and fall of woman? Think of an innocent man's being forced to murder 1,000 of them before he could find one. Think of the fair-mindedness with which he 1,000 times conducted his examination. Then there is the case of Bluebeard, a tale of the highest moral import. Or take the case of Henry VIII. Look at his trials and misfortunes. If any man were perfectly happy with his wife, would he ever murder her? You imagine yourself unhappy because you believe you have lost some greater happiness. On the contrary, you should consider yourself happy in having perhaps escaped the necessity of becoming a homicide. He is implied to maybe be joking, but that if he is, this was the, quote, solitary effort of his life to be humorous, so, you know. Thankfully, this version does not include the Reverend going on to have a large gaggle of daughters, for their sakes. John still leaves town and writes letters back to Jessica. He seemingly doesn't go to prison at any point. He invites Jessica to his wedding, and though she's tempted to go to see if he's making another mistake in his choice of women, it's a ways to travel, and she doesn't. It is only after he has had several children with his wife, who is actually deserving of a name in this version, she's called Eleanor, that Jessica's husband dies, at which point she receives letters from both John and Eleanor, begging her to come live with them, to not be alone. But Jessica says she has lived 2 lives already. She is too old to begin a third. She still grows older, and then John sends his 18-year-old son, also John, to live with her. He never wrote to Jessica much about his wife Eleanor, but in the letter that he sends with John Jr., he explains why, that it would have felt like writing a report for her inspection and approval of Eleanor's character, and that he didn't want to subject someone he loves to the critical examination of another. But he hopes that through speaking with and observing John Jr., she will be able to see the virtue of Eleanor's character. Then he gives a fairly similar speech about his hopes for John Jr. to achieve what he never did in Kentucky and about the virtues that he and Jessica had discussed, and the story ends. Notably, this earlier draft does not contain a John-aunt-niece love triangle, which is very interesting to me, and I really wonder what prompted Allen to go back and rewrite his own novella to double its length and add that in as the new main plot. Overall, I generally prefer the John Gray version, not because it's lacking the Jessica love story, but mostly because of those ways in which Choir feels awkwardly stretched and less cohesive. There are ways in which it was better, but there's just some scenes and story elements that I think lost some rhythm and flow and structure when the new material was added in, and some things, for some reason, got taken out that I think were good. And I'm really curious what some of the thought processes were for some of those. But I think that is enough time spent picking apart their differences, so I will catch you next time, I hope, and in the meantime you can catch me on this podcast's Twitter or Instagram, both at YOBPOD, YOBBPOD. Have a wonderful day, and for today's life advice from the past, don't get married.